Good afternoon. My name is Tara Masiku, and today I will be discussing African American adolescents in the Chicago public schooling system. First, I'd like to share with you a table of contents in the order of which I'll be sharing my information. First, we'll go over background, which is some insight of African American schooling and its history. Next, I'll do an introduction to compare achievement rates. Third, I will go into 3 in-depth effects of Chicago's schooling system and how it will affect generations to come. And lastly, I'll be going over some solutions to help fix the problems that they face today. It is wrong to force them to continue attending schools that are set up for failure. This quote is by the Illinois policy, which addresses African American students being at a disadvantage compared to other students. Before we dive into the effects of Chicago's schooling system, I want to first tell you a little bit about the history of Chicago's schooling system. So segregation, which is the divide or the enforced separation of different racial groups in a country, community, or establishment, and it is a pressing issue contributing to the discriminatory schooling system in Chicago. First, we see ghettos, which are usually in cities where there's a dense population of minority groups where they rely on each other, and typically this is caused by societal pressure, which leads to underfunding. Next, we have social norms, which is just where it's normalized for African Americans to be thought of less than in the educational system. And lastly, we have racism, which was a key effect and a cause of the segregation in schooling systems, which lead us to a timeline. These are 3 main dates main years where we can see things changing in the schooling system. In 1849, schools are completely segregated. In 1954, schools become legally integrated, meaning white and black students are now officially gaining education together. And in 2021, students have the same curriculum but are still breaking general barriers to this day. All of this leads us to the question, to what extent does the Chicago public schooling system negatively affect African American adolescents in the 21st century? The first effect is mental disorders. Students in Chicago are exposed to mental disorders without readily available access to help. They face challenges with common mental issues such as anxiety, depression, and self-image issues. First, anxiety, where students can feel pressure to break stereotypes or fear that they cannot fulfill others' expectations. Next is depression, where they feel sad or lost because they're not living up to expectations set by themselves or family members, and they're not prepared for what they're dealing with in school. And lastly, self-image, where their self-worth or value decreases because of their performance. And the stimuli does states learning to balance being themselves and fitting in with their social groups can be particularly challenging during adolescence. And Stephen Cohen, the author of Racial Microstressors, Racial Self-Concept, and Depressive Symptoms Among Male African Americans During the Transition to Adulthood, states that routine experiences of unfair treatment based on race can lead to feeling the perception of oneself as worthless and powerless, which leads to students thinking less and less of themselves, causing a poor performance. Chicago is guilty of having situations where students feel targeted or pressured because of their schooling. This led us to our second effect on Black students, which is graduation risk, when kids feel they don't have the resources for their education. Whether it is because of the previously mentioned issue of self-image and mental health, kids doubting themselves also don't have the proper resources if they were to be in a properly funded school. If you would take a look at this graph, you can see that white students depicted in red, graduation rate has went from 91.5, almost reaching 100, to 81.7, with a slight decline in the years from 2000 to 2021. While Black students in the year from 2000, which is 83.7%, has decreased all the way to 42%, which is a major decline that we're seeing in our communities. These are the struggles that African American students are facing every day. And this will lead us to our last point, which is risk of incarceration. Students feel that they have no way out, and as mentioned earlier, they stay in ghettos where they can give up on their self-image and conform to those around them, which is negative community impacts. So here's a map where we'll be looking at Chicago, A, which has a high amount of gang violence. Florida, B, while crime is still present, we see Incarceration rate for 18-year-olds is not as high, which is the general graduation age, and Ohio has a very low crime rate. All of these have a pretty dense African American student population. But not so fear, there are solutions for every issue. One solution is giving students of color a safe space to express how they feel. The next solution is an app or website where students are available to help in tutoring. And third is government funding towards schools and ghettos. So one thing that the app would have is a ability to help with tutoring, to access tutoring, or to access help and talk to people who have been through the same thing, so they have a positive sense of community rather than previously mentioned a negative sense of community where their peers are not going down the correct path because of what they've been exposed to in their childhood and in those schools. However, there are limitations with every solution. The first one is funding. Governments would need a sense of urgency as well as schools, and they would need to find funding, which can be gathered through fundraisers or states or any way that the schools can make money and raise so they have those programs that are offered in other schools. And next is student willingness, where students will have to open up to the idea of changing their education that they're used to and trying to work a little bit harder to find access to tutoring and studying. Now, you may believe that these issues are something that every student can face, but in actuality, most of the properly funded schools have the resources, but kids just do not take advantage of them because it is not offered towards kids who truly need them. These issues are exclusive to Black students, especially in Chicago, because of lack of exposure. To conclude, Chicago schools are made for an unfair education towards Black students. And I'd like to leave you with this. There are 7.7 million Black high schoolers in the United States, and they deserve every fair and equal opportunity as their white counterparts. Here's my work cited. Any questions?
I do have two questions for you. First up, how valid and reliable were the sources that you used, and then how do you know?
The sources that I used were very reliable because I used sources from the stimuli, which were from College Board, and they had been checked and gone through a process of being checked. And then I also used sources from EDUs and educational websites where the sources were valid and the numbers were checked by scientists.
Okay. And if you had more time, what additional research would you do on this?
If I had more time, I would have taken a bit more in-depth look at Chicago itself, because these problems, while most prominent in Chicago, are also things that you can find anywhere else. So I would have liked to maybe find a specific person who would have given an example. Like, as there was this vlogger I didn't get to mention, but he was in the Chicago schooling system and dropped out, and he ended up being successful once he dropped out in the 8th grade and was homeschooled from there on because the schooling system wasn't offering him what he needed.